Hello, all you intrepid adventurers of the interconnected interwebs, and welcome to the Average Game Enthusiast. I'm your host, the Average Video Game Enjoyer, and as always on this channel, I hope to be able to bring you just one more reason to be enthusiastic about whatever game we happen to be discussing. With that in mind, today we're going to be diving into the next part of my Fnaf theory timeline videos. So, in my last timeline video, we finished off with the death of Elizabeth Afton at the hands of Circus Baby and William burying her under the mound of earth that we see in the Midnight Motorist minigames. Today, we're picking up with the rest of Midnight Motorist events, the reason being that I believe the next child to die is, as you might expect, Charlie. Now, the reason that I think that William goes after Charlie, as opposed to some random kid like he does with the missing children's incident, has to do with the knowledge I speculated he gained from researching Remnant in the previous video. From this research, William would have known all about possessions and the importance of agony in the creation of haunted objects. And it is this knowledge that I think William uses to come up with his plan to kill Charlie. It's made pretty clear by this point that William has begun to abuse alcohol at this point in the timeline, and that while he's stewing in this drunken state, that this is when I think he's coming up with the idea of Charlie as his next victim. Because from William's perspective, he needs more desperately than ever to figure out a way to put his family back together, right? To continue this plan that he's been working on. Because after all, he already had lost his wife before any of the murders happened, and now he's lost Elizabeth because of the whole baby incident. And even if by this point, rather, he's realized that Elizabeth's soul has anchored itself onto Baby, he would be hesitant probably to do experiments on her because that could damage her soul, and he doesn't really have a way of mitigating the risk there. So what's he going to do, right? Because by this point, the fun times have been, put into storage and are going to be set up for Circus Baby's entertainment and rentals, which will come much, much later down the timeline. But he doesn't have a way to use them again, right? So what's he going to do while, the fallout of Circus Babies is being handled, and he doesn't have another easy, non-direct murder option, right? Because by this point, if he's going to kill again, he's going to have to do it himself. And so that leads to the question, well, who's he going to kill? And how can he guarantee that that victim's soul will actually latch itself onto, this mortal plane still instead of just moving on into the afterlife? This problem was plaguing William for a long time while he was drinking himself numb to the pain of his family suffering. But slowly, the solution came to him. He had decided a long time ago that a child would be the most easy to select as a victim. A child is easy to overpower, easy to manipulate and lure away into an unseen location. He also knew from his research that agony was the most powerful of human emotions to play a role in the creation of haunted objects. So the question was simple. What child could he kill that would create a powerful enough atmosphere of agony to ensure that the child's soul would possess something? Well, of course, any parent losing a child would be sure to create an agonized spiral. He himself could attest to that. But on the other hand, there were, unfortunately, a variety of parents who, unfortunately, would not care one way or the other about what happens to their children. So, how could William ensure that a child he found and killed would have a parent who would truly be heartbroken over the loss? After all, he couldn't just risk a murder attempt on a stranger and gamble their feelings on whether or not he gets the possession that he needs for his family to be rebuilt. But then, one fateful night, after a long time drinking, the answer came to him. Charlie. Henry, of course, cared deeply for his daughter, so much so that in the aftermath of Elizabeth's disappearance, he had added extra protections for her, making the security puppet specifically recognize her color of wristband that she wore at their restaurant to make sure that she was safe. Not to mention the fact that Charlie is also the only family that Henry still has. And on top of it, Charlie's death would add another layer of agony because William is a trusted friend of Henry and a business partner, a long time, relationship that he's had. And so a betrayal on that close of a level would certainly be agonizing. It seemed the perfect plan, and William was honestly surprised with himself that he hadn't thought of it before now. Henry, his closest friend, his greatest rival, and his partner all these years. Yes, he would be sure to be the one to give William the agonizing atmosphere that he needed to put his own family back together. William smiled to himself as he headed out to his car. He'd been itching to take some action again for so long, and now that he had his chance, he wasn't about to wait for second thoughts. He had a family to rebuild, after all, and he needed to get it started now. And so William set out, driving swiftly to the restaurant, and what he found waiting there for him was better than anything he could have dreamed of. In that moment, it seemed to him that Lady Luck had finally chosen to smile upon him. For, in the secluded back alley of the restaurant, alone, sopping wet from the rain, and desperately trying to get back inside the building, was none other than Charlie. William pulled up beside the terrified girl and stepped out of his car. It was too easy. Charlie, having recognized who he was, ran straight up to him. William, after all, was her father's best friend, and Charlie would have had no reason to suspect any malicious intent from him. On the contrary, she likely would have been thankful he turned up. After all, here was someone she could trust, someone who could help her back inside the building, someone who could keep the bullies away. But unfortunately, as we all know, Charlie was mistaken. William attacked the defenseless child in the dark and deserted alleyway, killed her. Then, knowing her body being found outside the restaurant right after a party would only add to the agony of the atmosphere, he decided to leave Charlie where she was and drive away. And just as the sound of his car faded away into the night, another sound rang out into the deserted alleyway. The jingling sound of the front doors opening sounded out into the night. The security puppet had finally managed to break out of the box in which it had been trapped by the same bullies who forced Charlie out of the building. Stepping out into the dark and rain-filled night, the puppet looked around the alleyway for the girl it was programmed to protect. It saw her, lying beneath one of the windows in the alley, and even as the rain started to cause it to short-circuit, the puppet moved to help the little girl. However, by the time it reached her, it was already too late. Charlie was beyond saving. All the puppet could do as the rain beat down on its non-waterproofed wires was to lay down beside the child and die with her. But in that moment, as death creeped over Charlie, and as the last of the puppet's circuits were broken down, William's plan worked. Charlie's soul latched on to the security puppet, and she took possession of the animatronic that had been designed with the same unyielding purpose that now gripped her soul. The purpose being to SAVETHEM. Save them, as the death minigames from Fnaf 2 would tell us. But while Charlie's soul was taking possession of the puppet, William was driving back home, desperately trying to put as much distance between himself and the murder scene as possible. Now, I think for this next segment of events, I need to break off that narrative format that I was just using, because this section is going to need some in-depth explaining. So, the events of Midnight Motorist show us that when William gets back to his house after he's killed Charlie, right, later that night, he finds one of his family members sitting at the house and watching TV. This family member tells him to, quote, leave him alone tonight. He had a rough day today. William ignores this person sitting before the TV and goes on to yell at the person he was asked not to be hard on, telling them that he had told them not to lock their door. Now, there's been a lot of debate over the years as to who all of these characters are, right? What characters fill what roles. And for a lot of theories, a lot of FNAF theories over the years, it's been a really tough balancing act of who can be who. But for my theory, I've actually got it pretty easy, because if you'll remember from my last theory video, at this point, Elizabeth and Mrs. Afton are both dead. And so, meaning that the only possible people that could be in this minigame, assuming of course that Midnight Motorist is depicting the Afton family, are William, Michael, and the crying child. This makes it really easy to assign roles. William is obviously Orange Guy, Michael is the one watching TV, and the crying child is the one who gets yelled at and who runs away. Now, there are probably a couple of objections that will get lobbed at me right away for this selection of characters. The first probably being, if Michael is the one watching TV, why is he defending the crying child from William? After all, Mike is the one who ruthlessly bullies the crying child throughout FNAF 4, so why stick up for him here? Well, I think the answer is twofold. One reason is that while Michael did obviously bully the crying child, we know that from the hospital bedside dialogue at the end of FNAF 4, Michael regrets the prank that he and his friends pulled, which indicates to me that even though from our outside perspective, Michael was a jerk to his brother, Michael himself probably thought that he was just having a good laugh at his oversensitive younger brother, which would explain why when William comes home drunk and prepares to possibly abuse his younger brother, Mike would try and stick up for him and try and get him to stop, even if Mike himself isn't the nicest guy to his brother. After all, practical joking and straight up abuse are two very separate things. The other reason that I think could explain Mike's difference in behavior in this scene is the fact that he doesn't have his Foxy mask yet. The reason I think this could be important is that it could indicate that Midnight Motorist takes place before Mike becomes a part of that mask-wearing bully gang that we see in FNAF 4. And this might be indicating that Mike only starts bullying the crying child when he becomes a part of that gang because he's a part of that gang. Which would mean that at this point in the timeline, before he becomes a part of that gang, he isn't bullying the crying child, so he's just being a good older brother and is trying to stick up for his younger brother from their drunken and, at the very least, verbally abusive father. However, attitude differences aside, the other main objection to the idea of Mike being the one sitting in front of the TV and the crying child being the one to run away comes from a combination of the security logbook and a Tales of the Pizzaplex story, Didophobia. It is believed by many theorists that Didophobia is giving us more context about the true nature of FNAF 4's nightmares. This is because the story focuses around the book's version of the FNAF 4 gameplay. This parallel is generally applied to the game lore by saying that William's threat at the end of Midnight Motorist of "he'll be sorry when he gets home" is in fact a reference to William choosing to use the same, or at the very least similar, nightmare chambers on his runaway child as the ones we see in Didophobia. This interpretation is then often paired with the fact that Michael draws the FNAF 4 nightmares in the security logbook. These two pieces of evidence, then, lead people to the conclusion that Michael has to be the one that William put into the nightmare chambers, and that he is therefore the kid who ran away during the events of Midnight Motorist. And the one who is sitting in front of the TV is usually substituted for Mrs. Afton. I disagree with this interpretation. However, I don't think it's impossible by any means. But, again, to reiterate what I said earlier, my timeline, as far as it's concerned, Mrs. Afton is already dead, and she's been dead for a while now, meaning that she literally can't be the person who's sitting in the chair watching TV, which kind of requires me to put Michael in that place. However, I think it's important that we go through this discussion because I have another explanation from my own as to the events of Didophobia and the security logbook. I'm not just going to try and sweep it away with, oh, my last video said something, and so this video has to be in line with that. No. I have an explanation. So, I think there is a way to explain how the crying child was the one in the nightmares, still allow for Mike to know about the nightmares and be able to draw them, and even explain why the security logbook works the way it does, with having Mike, Cassidy, and the crying child all talking to each other at the same time. And that explanation comes from yet another of the Tales of the Pizzaplex stories, this time being the story entitled Alone Together. In this story, we learn that spirits of the dead in the FNAF universe can linger in places they once lived, unaware that they're dead. We also learn that they can influence people's dreams and memories, and even be seen by certain types of people. This information has led me to the belief that the crying child's soul is, in a manner of speaking, split between a connection to the Fredbear suit in which he was bitten, and a connection to his older brother Michael, who he is now influencing. This influence could have potentially caused Michael to share some of the crying child's own memories and experiences inside of his dreams. This then could explain how Mike knows about the nightmare animatronics and why when he experiences the nightmares for himself, he hears the FNAF 1 phone calls during the nightmares, even though it was the crying child who originally ran away during Midnight Motorist and was placed into the nightmare chambers. Mike's reimagining of them blends the crying child's experiences with his own memories of that FNAF 1 phone call, creating the gameplay that we see during FNAF 4. This split soul influence theory also serves as an explanation to how the security logbook works. The crying child's soul is connected to both Michael and the suit that houses Cassidy. and this allows him to become a medium for their communication. I think this theory with the crying child being the one who gets punished with the nightmare chambers also lines up a bit more with some of the parallels to didophobia. The reason being is that the method of keeping the person in didophobia's nightmare chamber stuck inside is to have a recorder playing a message that would convince the person inside the chamber that they were safe and cared for while they remained inside the chamber. This, I would argue, has a stronger connection to the crying child than it does to Michael. The reason for that is that in the Fnaf 4 cutscenes, William is constantly whispering both warnings and words of comfort to the crying child, encouraging him that tomorrow is another day when he gets locked inside his bedroom, and saying to him, and in the hospital bed scene, "We're still here. We are still your friends." William's actions through the Fredbear plushie during Fnaf 4 feel, to me at least, like a better parallel of evidence to the nature of didophobia than speculating about similar things being done to Michael without any evidence. However, book-based interpretations aside, my theory, again, still has to posit that Mike and the crying child are who they are in Midnight Motorist, because literally all the other family members are dead, and William is obviously the orange guy. So, with all that being said, it's time to move on, because I just wanted to give my evidence and some context for why I believe in, obviously, my own timeline of events, as opposed to the interpretation of many other FNAF theorists. But anyways, moving on to why the crying child ran away in the first place, and where. In my opinion, I can see two possibilities to where the crying child could have run off to. One is that he went to Fredbear's, and thereby found Charlie's dead body. And the reason that he went there was either because he simply wanted to see the animatronics that he loved so much, in spite of his father's demands that he stay home, or he was brought there by the three-toed character whose footprints we see outside the house. As to who that three-toed character is, well, my theories are pretty short on possessed characters for it to be at this point in the timeline, so really my only explanations for it is that it's either A, if it's someone leading the crying child away, it has to be a manifestation probably of agony that was resulting from Charlie's death. But that's pretty loose and not really well supported, and I have literally no evidence for that other than speculation. So the other thing that I think it could be, as opposed to that being someone who led the crying child to the location he ran to, I think the other idea for who that three-toed character could be is William using one of the mascot suits to scare the crying child into staying home by lurking outside his window and scaring him with one of the animatronic suits. This would have been sort of an earlier iteration of what would eventually become the Nightmare Chambers. However, again, both of those are really speculative, and I'm honestly not entirely sure who that three-toed character outside the window is supposed to be. Those are just kind of my theories and my speculations on it. But the other possible location that I think the crying child could have run off to, and is, in my opinion, probably the one that makes a little bit more sense for my theory, is that he's running to Elizabeth's grave, that mound of earth that William buried her under, that we see in Midnight Motorist. This would, of course, be based off the idea that the thing the crying child saw, right, the thing that scared him, is Elizabeth's death, that he actually saw Circus Baby scoop her. We know, of course, that Elizabeth was the only one who was visibly in the room with Circus Baby at the time of her death. Baby herself tells us that during the events of Sister Location. However, just because Baby didn't see him doesn't mean that the crying child can't have been in the vicinity of the room to have seen the death happen. As I talked about in my last theory video, not only does Baby kind of go into a state of confusion where she doesn't really understand what's happening around her once the kidnap program starts up in her, right? Once she's alone with Elizabeth, her programming switches to kidnap child mode, and her mental faculties become confused. But it also wouldn't have been impossible for the crying child to have simply been hiding somewhere, either behind something or down a hallway that Baby couldn't have seen, and then him only to have come into the room proper after he hears Elizabeth scream when Baby grabs her. And this would then allow for him to have been not in the room and Baby's program to activate, but still have been close enough to witness the death once it started happening. This is very important, as if the crying child did see Elizabeth die, he would have also known that William's missing persons report for her was false, and he therefore might have known that William was lying about what happened to Elizabeth. Thus, he might have started going to look for Elizabeth's body since he knew she died, and once he found it, he keeps on returning to it. This would also help to explain why William is so determined to stop him from going there, because he doesn't want the crying child drawing attention to the gravesite of the child who he reported missing, right? He can't have people finding the crying child at this grave, asking what he's doing there, and then have to deal with the fallout of he's buried his child that he filed the missing persons report for, right? He doesn't want that to happen. So it also is an explanation as to why he's so vague about where the crying child is going to, right? Because, you would expect if he was referring to like Fredbear's Family Diner or Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, he would actually say the name of the location or just say restaurant in general or even just building. But instead, he just says that place again. This, I think, is Scott Coffin trying to give us a hint that the location that Crying Child is going to isn't like a building or a restaurant or anything like that, but rather it's one of these secret hidden locations that we find in one of the off-shooting paths of the Midnight Motorist minigame. However, regardless of where you think the Crying Child went to and why, the specifics of it doesn't fully matter. It obviously gives a lot more context and is important to determine for the, laying out of the timeline. But if you don't agree with my interpretation, that doesn't mean you have to throw out the rest of my theory. It just means we have a disagreement about where the crying child went and why. Because the events that follow aren't super impacted by the specific location of where the crying child went. It really just matters more that he ran away in general. Because once he runs away, William punishes him by putting him in the nightmare experiments and giving him later the psychic friend Fredbear plushie that he talks to him through during Fnaf 4. And obviously the reason he does that is so that he can keep an eye on him and to prevent him from running away again, while also being able to keep him so scared of the animatronics that he wouldn't be in danger of suffering like a baby Elizabeth-style incident again. However, as any of the fans of the franchise will know by this point, William's plan doesn't work. For on the crying child's birthday, when Michael was left in charge of watching over the crying child, Mike and his gang of bullying friends decide to play a prank on the poor kid, forcing him to face his worst fear by shoving him headfirst into the mouth of the Fredbear animatronic. William could do nothing but watch, through the eyes of the psychic friend Fredbear plushie, as his youngest son squirmed in terror and begged for release, only for Fredbear's mouth to snap down on the young boy's head. The crying child would be rushed to the hospital and trapped in a coma for an unknown amount of time, after which he would die. The incident, later dubbed the Bite of 83, became the final nail in the Fredbear Family Diner's coffin. Charlie's murder outside the building, and now the crying child's death back to back, was too much for that side of the brand to handle, and the restaurant closed its doors for good. The yellow mascot suits were retired to the safe rooms of the now stand-alone Freddy's location, along with the newly relocated security puppet, which would begin its operation again in the new location. Now, what Freddy's location is this, you ask? Well, I believe that is the first opening of the FNAF 2 location. After all, we know from the FNAF 2 newspapers that the launching of that building in 1987 is a reopening featuring the toy animatronics, and that the Wizards are only being used for parts starting in that reopened restaurant, meaning that sometime before 1987, a Freddy's restaurant that was presumably using the Wither animatronics as its main mascots before they became, well, the Wizards, was in operation. However, the opening of this new restaurant, the one before 1987, poses a problem for William. What problem is that? Well, the fact that just like how the puppet is still in use by the time of 1987, it's likely that the puppet was also in use during this iteration of the Freddy's restaurant. Meaning that William had no way of extracting the puppet, and more importantly, the soul contained inside, to run experiments on. This is especially problematic for William, as he is yet again another kid down. And this time, he's made a direct promise to that kid to put him back together, unlike the other family members who he hasn't been able to do that with. This puts William in quite the desperate situation, where not only does he need to get more souls, but he now needs to put them in a place that he can access after he's killed them, so that he can ensure that he can get his experiments done. This leads to him formulating the plan that we know as the missing children's incident. William puts on one of the retired golden mascot suits and lures the 5 kids one by one to the secret safe room, in which he murders each one of them. He then exits the building and waits to see if the souls will take root in the restaurant. And as we know, they do. The death minigames show us the possession taking place in the Give Gifts, Give Life minigame, in which we see Charlie helping to guide the souls of each of the missing kids to each animatronic and thereby allowing them to take possession of the suits. In the aftermath of the missing children's incident, an investigation is launched, and the restaurant is temporarily shut down while the police try and discover what happened. We know from the Fnaf 1 newspapers that while the bodies of the children were never found, the articles say that a suspect was brought in and charged, and the headlines of some of the articles say that the suspect was convicted. Now, we know from later events down the timeline that this convicted individual can't be William, because if William was convicted for 5 counts of child kidnap and possibly murder, he definitely would have been in jail way too long for him to do any of the later events down the timeline, like the dead child incident or the minigame Follow Me. It would have made those impossible. Now, that leaves the question, who did the cops convict, right? Who got framed for William's crime? Well, fellow theorist Rytost speculates that it could be Henry. In his video, Was Henry Part of William's Crime? Link in the description. Rytost brings up the Fnaf 1 posters, as I do, and argues that they could indicate that Henry was framed for the events of the missing children's incident. This would explain why William never went to jail, but it also would explain where Henry was for most of the franchise up until FNAF 6. He was in prison. Now, the truth of that theory is highly debatable, and to be honest, I'm not sure if I entirely agree with it. But the point still stands that pointing out the fact that the headlines say the suspect was convicted, not just charged, but actually convicted, poses an interesting wrench in the usual understanding of how the missing children's incident is usually portrayed. However, as we know, again, the later events of the timeline aren't really affected by this point because, again, it's not William who gets charged or convicted, so it doesn't really matter for the next series of events down the timeline. It is just an interesting point to bring up, and it's an easy way to shout out Rytost, who made a great video about the topic. And so, continuing though, William's murders caused the Freddy's location to shut down in 1985 due to the missing children's incident, only for the location to have a grand reopening in 1987, after the police investigations are unable to find the bodies and have to close the case, and once the company has had time to regain public trust and plan its next move. However, even though Freddy's is once again open to the public, it doesn't pose as big a problem to William this time as it did with Charlie's soul the way it did before. The reason is that the withered animatronics, which contain the souls of his latest victims, weren't being used as performers in this new restaurant. Instead, they were simply kept in parts and service and used for spare parts when needed. This, of course, would have allowed William to extract the parts he needed for his experiments. Or at least it would have in theory. However, one question still remains. How can William get inside the restaurant, take the parts of the animatronics without getting caught? Well, I believe the gameplay and death minigames of FNAF 2 gives us our answer. I believe that William himself gets a night guard position at this location. Now, I know that probably sounds a little strange, as the general belief of the night guard's identity in all of the games is Michael Afton. And to be honest, if Michael is the night guard at this location, it doesn't actually change the way my theory goes. It just changes who's doing it. And it doesn't really affect the main outcome, but the reason that I posit William as being the candidate for the one who is the night guard at the FNAF 2 location is because in the FNAF 2 death minigames, when we see Purple Guy, when we see him appear and attack Freddy during those minigames, he looks like he's wearing a security badge on his chest. And I've got some images to display this, right? So this is the FNAF 2 minigame where Purple Guy purple guy is coming out to attack Freddy, and then I've got a close-up on his sprite. So, like you can see, I don't really know what else you would say that this little mark is. I mean, obviously, the minigames are in 8-bit, so, like, take it or leave it as an evidence point, but, like, to me, I don't really know what else you would say that little orange mark on his chest is supposed to represent, other than a security guard badge. But again, whether it was William himself or Mike acting on William's orders doesn't really matter. The outcome is still the same because we know that night guard gets fired for tampering with the animatronics. And we know from later mini games that William was still unable to get all of the parts he needed for his research while the restaurant is open and the night guard is going, because he has to come back later during the events of the Follow Me minigame. This inability to get the remnant he needs after the security guard job is lost is what causes William to make what might be his most desperate move in the whole franchise. With him being able to unaccess any subjects for his experiments, and without any other method of moving forward his plan to rebuild his family without getting that remnant, William decides to commit the dead child incident. He sneaks back inside the restaurant and once again dons one of the golden mascot suits. He then kills 5 more kids and leaves their bodies all over the restaurant, out in the open for everyone to see. That way, the bodies will be found and the building will immediately get shut down. The plan works. The Fnaf 2 location is put on lockdown while police investigations begin. During this lockdown, the minigame called Follow Me takes place. The minigame depicts the Fnaf 2 building while it is on lockdown. All the animatronics still around and working, but no one inside the building to watch over them, giving them free rein to roam the halls. Over the course of what is thought to be several nights, William breaks into the building and lures the missing child incident possessed robots to the back rooms where he dismantles them and harvests their remnant for his experiments with the Funtime animatronics. However, after dismantling the last of the MCI robots, William returns again to the old restaurant. Why? Well, some theorists propose that he was returning to check for any remnant he may have left behind. Others say that he was returning to get the Spring Bonnie suit, believing that, just as in the books, the suit allows him to better blend in and control the MCI kids. Both of these theories have their merits, and are plausible explanations as to why William would return again after he's already gotten all the MCI kids. But I would add on another possible idea to that way of thinking just to give it a bit more evidence. Because I think one of the things we often gloss over is the fact that he literally could have just been returning to claim Charlie's soul as well. After all, he hadn't been able to get at the puppet until this point, even if he's already gotten all the MCI kids. This would also make sense as Charlie has sort of been the rallying point for all the other animatronics. She's the one stirring them up to fight back against William, and he may have wanted to make sure that she would never stir up trouble again. Regardless of which of these theories, or if any of them, are right, William does return one more time. And, as depicted in the Fnaf 3 ending cutscenes, the souls of the MCI kids attack, scaring William into the fatal mistake of putting on the Golden Bonnie suit. As William hastily pulls on the suit, the kids' souls freeze. Even Cassidy, the vengeful spirit herself, pauses in her advance at the sight of the suit that had once caused her and the other kids so much pain and suffering. For a moment, it seemed William had won, that he would be able to scare the kids away and escape. Relief began to spread through him as he began to laugh. However, all of a sudden, he heard a noise that would haunt him for the rest of his existence. A faint tick, tick, tick. The sound of the Springlocks starting to come loose. William didn't know what the cause was. Had he, in his haste to put on the suit, not fastened the Springlocks properly? Were the suits, which had been out of use so long, even more sensitive than they had been before? Was it a result of the water dripping from the poorly maintained ceilings? Or was it simply fate coming to collect its due? In the end, it didn't matter. William didn't have time to so much as raise his hands to the suit's headpiece before the Springlocks failed, and the metal parts of the animatronic suit snapped straight into him. The pain was unimaginable. Every inch of his body was stabbed, cut, and squashed as the metal frame of the robot was forced into his body. William collapsed backward, and crumpled in a bloody heap against the wall. His blood saturated the suit in seconds and began pooling onto the ground around him. His eyes were forced out of their sockets and his teeth pushed back into his skull as the metal head of the golden bunny merged with his own. As the kids saw what had happened to him, they began to leave. One by one, they left the gruesome scene that was before them. Some of them were satisfied to see their killer get what they felt he deserved. Others simply horrified by what they had witnessed. And perhaps one or two of them a feeling of pity for the brutal end to the monster that had attacked them all those years ago. However, even if some of them did feel sorry about what had happened, there was nothing they could do to change it. And so William was left alone, blind, shaking, and slowly drowning in his own blood, trapped in the very suit that he had used to take the lives of so much innocence. Fate really did have a poetic sense of humor, didn't it? William's body would be found by a Fazbear employee and be reported to the higher-ups at the company. And Fazbear Entertainment did what Fazbear Entertainment does. They hid the truth and waited for a chance to rebrand. William's corpse would be sealed in the safe rooms, as the order went out from Fazbear to conceal all knowledge of every single safe room at all locations. And so, with that, we leave the timeline where it is for today, with William being trapped inside the safe room and his reign of terror finally at an end. For now. He would be back eventually, of course. William always comes back. But he has 30 years to go before that glorious day of freedom. But in the next video, we'll be pivoting character POVs and focusing on Michael Afton's adventures into Circus Baby's entertainment and rentals. But that video still has to be written and recorded, and I have to get all the stuff together for it until I can upload it. So with that all being said, I want to say thank you all so much for watching part 2 of my Fnaf Timeline series. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, be sure to drop a like on this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on all notifications. That way you'll be the first to be notified when that next video releases. Finally, be sure to drop me a comment telling me what you thought of today's theory, what your own theories about the Fnaf timeline are, or if you're interested in watching me play some games, feel free to drop a suggestion about what game you'd like me to play and theorize about. I have a Twitch, the Average Video Game Enjoyer, so if you want to see me do some gameplay streams, you can go check me out over there. Or you can just wait for the VODs to come out on this YouTube channel, the Average Game Enthusiast. But yeah, so that's all I have for today, for today's video. I hope you all have a God bless day, and as always, I'm your host, the Average Video Game Enjoyer, and this is the Average Game Enthusiast, signing off. Bye-bye!